Hello plant friends, my name is Victoria and you're watching Plantastics. Today we're going to be repotting all of my African violets. What soil should you use? Well, it really just depends, which I'm sure is everyone's least favorite answer. Previously I used a different soil, but now I'm using a 50-50 mix of perlite and Miracle-Gro organic mix. And perlite has particles, small particles. You do not want to inhale these. I have a fan that's blowing the dust away from me. If you don't have a fan, I suggest you wear a mask because you don't want to breathe it in and get that to settle into your lungs. So I previously used the Miracle-Gro potting mix, and it came with fertilizer in it. And the issue that I ran into was that I started getting something called orange crust, which is exactly like it sounds. It looks like Cheeto dust got on your African violets. There are many reasons why this can happen, and one of the reasons that I believe was causing it for me was there was fertilizer in the soil, and I was also using a fertilizer mix, and I think that's why it was happening. Also, I had the plants a little bit too far into the soil, so that also played a factor. And then there's like 4 reasons total, and those are 2 that I've told you just now. Here is Gillian. It is a named variety, and it had a nice root system. Some of these are better than others, but these are and have been in these pots for 6 months. So I repot in the spring and the fall, I believe. I really don't recall, but I do remember it being exactly 6 months. And it is fixing to be spring. I am mentally in spring mode already because all of my floral and garden shops have the spring plants that are kind of native to my area, so I am thinking of that often because I love spring. It's not too hot and there are so many beautiful flowers, which in the South we have flowers pretty much year round, but winter not so much. But there are many roses in my backyard that had flowers throughout the winter because they were crazy and it was an unusually warm winter. And I think that's interesting because it's been such an odd year that the cherry blossoms or the cherry trees in DC are blooming earlier than usual. So everything's just kind of confused. Here I have the soil. I have these vented pots. There is some soil that's on the leaves, and I'll address that later. So right now I'm basically repotting everything. Afterwards I'm going to brush off the leaves, and then I'm going to mist the soil around the plant, and that just gives the roots a chance to have some moisture but not too much. I also use these self-wicking, self-watering containers, and they are utilizing capillary action to water the soil, and it's not too much of a mystery. It's pretty effective, honestly. I highly recommend it because African violets really benefit from any method that is continuous watering because they like that, but it's like a happy medium. They don't like to be wet, but they like to have moisture. They don't really like to dry out. That's been my experience and many others. So that's why these are so great, because the plant takes what it needs. The soil stays at a very consistent level of moisture, and the plants seem to really like that. So here is my most lengthy neck, and I haven't defined what that is. So African violets have, their roots, they're epiphytic. Their roots are kind of more on the first inch or two of the soil. They don't really tend to go deep. Some plants are more, they have more depth than they do superficial, and this is just not one of those plants. So you can aim for shallower pots similar to these, and another reason why they're so great is because they don't go as deep as some of the other pots. So you've got your roots, and then you have like a stem. That's what I'm referring to as the neck. And you can see it looks like brown dots. That's where each leaf was before I pulled it off. Now in my previous video that I posted, when I was showing all of them in bloom, there were a lot more leaves, and I removed a lot of those leaves because I wanted to propagate them. There are many varieties that people really like, and sharing is caring, and sharing is also a form of conservation. So if you have a plant that you really enjoy, one of the best things you can do is share it with someone that is in your plant community, a plant friend. I've gotten lots of plant friends online, and we share. That's how I got my micro minis, my pings. I mean, I could go on and on. Sharing is so great. It's a very cheap way to share plants with people, and it's a 50-50 thing. You give people stuff and they give you stuff, so it's really nice. So that's what I'm in the process of doing. I can't remember how many plants. I can't remember if it's 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. I'm not going to have more than 20 just because I can't manage that many, but I've tried to take maybe 4 or 5 leaves from each variety, and I'm propagating those. So that's why they look so bare. And I don't really know if there's a perfect time to take leaves. I removed all of the blooms and a lot of leaves, and I propagated flower stalks and leaves. And honestly, I'd never propagated flower stalks, but it was actually kind of effective. I was kind of shocked. I didn't expect it to work at all. And it did work, but it was not as effective as using leaf propagations. So here is, I believe this is King's Ransom, but it's just resting right now and putting out new growth. And we've got some pretty nice leaves. Unfortunately, this is the time of year, and time of year meaning from the transition of winter to spring, that most African violet collectors, enthusiasts, growers, we all go through the same trauma, which is powdery mildew. And powdery mildew can be combated with a couple of things. The first thing you can do is increase your ventilation. The second is decrease your humidity. And the third is to spray neem oil. I sprayed and did all of these things early on, so I didn't have issues with it getting out of control because I acted early. And in doing that, I prevented an outbreak. So I don't have powdery mildew anymore, but I didn't have enough ventilation, fans blowing whenever I did spray the neem oil. So I do have a little bit of damage on some of my leaves. And what I'm showing you right now is a baby sucker forming. And they're really easy to take off. You just snap them off. So the neem oil sat on the leaves of this variety, and you can see if you really look that there is just a little bit of damage there. And that's something to be cautious of. When you spray neem oil, make sure that you have fans that will just increase the ventilation so that way it can evaporate at a faster rate. And you also may want to decrease your distance between your plants and your lights, because even though I'm using LEDs, I did have some burning on some of my leaves, which is interesting. Midnight Waterfall surprisingly suffered the most, followed by King's Ransom, and then the other plants, their leaves don't look like they're damaged in any way. So be mindful of that in your treatment of powdery mildew. So I have this mix, and as you can see when I'm popping these plants out of their pots, they have really nice root systems. And I don't say that to compliment myself. I'm just stating that they, because of certain things, were able to have really nice roots. The number one reason African violets die is because of overwatering. And African violets are an amazing, amazing group of plants because they can bloom year round. And with the right care, I mean, they can really be exciting plants. They don't have a time of year, they are all the time if given the right conditions. These are the best roots by far. This is just such a sought after variety, and it's unique. It's just so unusual. Unfortunately, I have chopped it to pieces because everyone wants it. So I am trading this as soon as I have propagations. I have several different props of this. And back to roots. So these pots have little slits on the sides, and there's also holes in the bottom. So I have really nice drainage if I choose to water from the top, which I don't typically do. And then the slits on the side allow for aeration. So there's nice aeration, and my hope in adding perlite and having a 50-50 mix is that I will have such a great additional amount of aeration that the roots grow even faster, and I'm hoping that I can have faster growth. I have been reading a book, and I highly recommend you also purchase it because I'll just be talking about some of the things that I enjoyed, but it's just so great. I read a lot in school, so I use that as like a motivator or a treat for when I've read 100 or so pages a night like I have to do. And I really enjoy it. It's very thorough, it's very to the point, it's in normal language that's easy to understand. There's not a lot of terminology. And it's a book that you can purchase either secondhand or through the African Violet Society of America, and it is called Growing to Show. And I believe all the proceeds go to the African Violet Association of America, Society of America, my bad. And it's a really great book. And one of the things that they stated was that you need to repot if you're showing. And that's something I'm going to, or I plan to get into. And that's why I'm making the changes that I'm making, is because I've done research, I've read that book, I've read some other forums, and this is closer to what they're doing in accomplishing these large, huge rosettes with these perfectly like symmetrical circles. Because I didn't notice this, but African violets grow 3 leaves at a time in a triangle, and you have to groom them as they're growing for them to create a rosette. And I'm in the process of learning that. And something that they suggested about soil was that you have perlite or vermiculite. Well, I, in my area, only had perlite and only the organic kind, which I thought was kind of funny because most of the time you have just a normal perlite and then you'll have organic, or like you go to the grocery store and you have the normal and then the organic. Well, this store only had the organic, so I really didn't have a choice. But something that I may be doing, this is really some trial and error what I'm doing with this mix, but I foresee it working out. But ideally in the future, I would like to try a substrate, a soilless mix of Canadian moss, Canadian sphagnum moss, vermiculite, and perlite. Whenever you're using some soilless substrate, you have to fertilize every time you water because there's no nutrients in that substrate. And that is something that there's a lot of science that you can get into with that. And I really like the ease of using soil because there's a lot of things in there and I don't have to monitor or add it. And I do enjoy that. So previously I used the Miracle-Gro potting mix, which has fertilizer in it already. It does have a little bit of perlite, but not, honestly, that much of an amount. It's really not noticeable. And I've used that, and that's what I'm removing from these pots in this video. So I'm changing to this organic and perlite. And as I stated, I had orange crust and I had a few other issues. And there are nutrients in the organic, but it won't be a synthetic fertilizer like what I'm using in addition to the soil. I also learned from this book that you want to use synthetic instead of organic because organic will clog the wicks and you won't have that capillary action. This plant is interesting, and I honestly do as I say and not as I do, because this one honestly could use a smaller pot. This is Midnight Waterfall, and it has some interesting leaf growth on it. It's had this happen with multiple leaves, but they'll grow like bunny ears. It's like a leaf is a twin, and it's weird. I've removed them for the most part, but because it has so few leaves at present, I'm just going to leave it. Simply because it's just so bare. So I'm just going to allow it to fill back in. And it's it's winter here, but we're starting to get a lot of pollen. It's like it's raining gold from the sky. Everything's covered in a thick gold dust. And that's just from the pollen. So it's easy to have allergies at this time of the year. But it's worth it because I love spring. So I am tapping. Tapping's pretty good. I recommend it. It's pretty nice. I think it's effective. This African violet is a prolific producer of suckers. Also, note this pot. It is not shallow. It goes straight down. And as I remove it, you'll see where the roots stop. So that's about how far the roots go. The first inch or two, and that bottom is just dead soil. It's dead mix. The roots never get that far. So something to just be mindful of, like you may want to put leca in the bottom or something like that. I'm not going to do that, but you could if you wanted to. Especially if you had a pot that went further down, it was deeper than this one is significantly. At that point, I would recommend it. So you may have this issue. It's really not too bad of an issue. But see, there are probably 4 or 5 plants. So what you're going to do is you're going to try to find a rosette. And then from there, a rosette, you think of a rose. There's one point in the center. And then all of the leaves kind of spiral out from that center. And then you're going to go to the base where it connects to the mother plant, and you're going to separate. And you just separate it with your hands. You're going to hear a crack, but that's okay. So you can see here you have 2 separate plants. And I'm going to further separate these. The mother plant, once I get down to it, is really sad looking because it's been devoting all of its energy to these suckers and ensuring their survival. And something you can do is remove suckers as soon as you see them. Because once it gets to this point, the main plant is kind of suffering. And in removing the suckers, you're going to have a lot of leaves fall off, and that's okay. As you know, they will grow back. And these plants are pretty fast growers, so you really won't be set back for too long. And sometimes the suckers have roots and other times they don't. None of these did, which honestly was kind of odd because most of the time they do. But it's not a big deal because you can just set them on top of soil or water and they'll grow roots pretty quickly. And because they already have all these leaves, they'll grow pretty quickly as well. So it's pretty nice. These as in the suckers, are super popular at plant swaps. Every time that I go to a plant swap and I have African violets, they are the first thing to go. People really dart for them, especially when they're blooming. And I can use a leaf and propagate it and have baby African violets that are blooming before they even get to their mature size. And it's just an interesting thing because you don't really have to wait around for African violets to bloom if you provide them the right conditions. Something else to note about this pot is it has a different wick than my other plants. So when I purchased these 2 African violets that are in this style of pot, they already came with wicking containers, and if I recall correctly, they were like $5 for the pot and the plant. With inflation, it'd probably today be like $6 or $7 because, everything's gone up. But it was super, super cool because it was so cheap for it being as pretty as it was. It just felt super cheap. It felt like a great deal. And I've just kept them in these pots and they've done so well. I think coming up on this spring, I will have had these noids for a year and they've done really well. So I've just, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And it's not broke. It seems to work for them. But it isn't optimal to have pots that will go that deep with African violets. You can overpot. So the standards that I have, I wouldn't put them in pots larger than the ones I have in diameter, simply because you're going to end up, even though you don't think you are, overwatering them, simply because the plant can't absorb, their root system just can't absorb the water in the soil. So this one was a propagation. It came from 2 leaves, and based off of my reading in the Growing to Show, I have been trying to groom this one. And it's got a really nice rosette. The ones that I pulled so many leaves off of, they are in the process of reforming all their leaves and their rosette. And I'm working on getting better at grooming as I go to promote symmetry. And that's something that I'll probably have a more detailed video on. I just want to work on kind of perfecting it. Not perfecting it, but really just trying to figure it out, honestly, because I'm reading and I've gone on YouTube and tried to find videos, because reading something sometimes is not as like, you try to imagine it and you just can't. So someone showing you is better than reading it sometimes. But yeah, powdery mildew season. It's really funny. I didn't know there was a season until I read an article about it, but the African Violet Society of America has a magazine. It comes out every 3 months. I highly recommend y'all get that because it just has so much great information. And there are tons of great videos on YouTube, but that book, oh my gosh, you're going to learn more from that book than anything else, because you do run the risk of getting bad advice anytime you seek advice or solicit advice, just period. And that honestly has some really great information. So I highly suggest you invest in purchasing that or trying to find it in your local library. But there's always someone that's been doing this for longer than you, and it's always great to take the time to learn what they've already learned, so that way you don't have to figure it out. There are the fuzzy stuff on the leaves of African violets. Those are called trichomes. I knew air plants had trichomes, but I didn't know other varieties and genuses had them as well. This plant is so unique. So that's one plant. It just has 2 different colored blooms. And Apparently, so I was reading the judging criteria for the show plants. There's like a rubric, and on the rubric is that the plant needs to look like the description. So the blooms need to be like a fuchsia if they're described as fuchsia and so on. And you can actually lose points for the flowers or the plant not looking like prior plants of that same hybrid or that same variety. And I just thought that was interesting. So if this was a show plant, I think I would lose some major points because each flower is so unique and different. And it's really funny because, I mean, it's all from the same plant. But this is not a named variety. This is a noid. So it doesn't really have a standard to stick to because it's not named. It doesn't have a description. It's just kind of like, it can be wild and crazy and all over the place. But something I have noticed is that in the winter, the blooms are white, and in the summer, they are purple burgundy-ish. Well, they're burgundy-ish, pinkish. And it's kind of funny because you can see the white blooms are all together, and the temperatures are starting to change, so there's going to be more and more burgundy. And in the summer, it's almost entirely burgundy, and the outer perimeter is white. And I just think that is so cool. And I learned from at r/African Violets on Reddit that the temperature can change the color of the bloom. So the more you know, am I right? But yeah, you can also wash the leaves, and you can do that because those trichomes collect dust and different things, and plants will better photosynthesize if their leaves are clean. But you do that by not getting any water on the crown, and you have some kind of ventilation close by so that liquid will dry off. So it is something that you can do. I know that they highly advise you not, and it's just that if you're not careful, you can get water in that crown, and it really doesn't have any way to get out once it's in there, so it can rot the crown of the plant. And if you have a plant that's rotting in the center, if it gets to a certain point, you really can't do anything about it. You can take a leaf and propagate it, but then it'll be quite a few months, maybe 3, maybe 6 months before it's to a mature size. I love this one. This one, honestly, I think has the second longest neck. The Optimara one with the dark leaves, I think it had the largest neck. But you can see, and each little dot was where a leaf was connected. And when you bury that neck, there are roots that are going to come out alongside it. And you also have greater stability. Also, I think the neck doesn't look that great. It's not exactly the star of the show. It's always leaves and flowers. I have seen people grow them and not repot them, and they leave the neck out, and it looks so odd. It's like they make it look like a tree. So you can see. Also, if you have light straight ahead or straight above, you'll have a straight neck. But if you have it in a window or where the light's coming at an angle or horizontally, you will need to turn the plant so that way it stays straight. Granted, you could repot it and no one would know. They wouldn't know that the neck is crooked or not. But it can be very obvious if you're in between repots that you didn't turn your plant. Even though I have the Barrina grow lights, well, these are the LED lights. I do turn mine anyways, and that just helps things be more even because I have the light bars. I have a great deal of space. It's not consistent, and some African violets will want to be directly underneath the light, and others will actually want to be a little further away. So even though they're the same thing, they're all African violets, depending on the very specific name variety, they can have different light needs. And that's just a nuance that you'll pick up on. Or I can just tell you and you don't have to figure it out, but that's something to take note of. Also, you can kind of think this, but it's not exactly always accurate, but some of the violets with darker leaves will need less light than some that have like high variegation or a lot of variegation. Variegation isn't based off of light with African violets, it's actually based off of nitrogen in the soil, which is very fascinating to me. But anyways, my Optimara, I believe it's a Texas 2. I honestly don't know, so it may not be, but I know it's an Optimara violet because I went back and looked at my pictures and it said it on the pot. But anyways, it needs a lot of light and it has nearly black leaves. It's a very goth looking plant, but it needs a lot of light. So that doesn't go as an always. It's not a black and white rule. So here I am. I have this makeup brush and I got it for travel. It has since been replaced, so it is now my African Violets makeup brush, which I think is kind of funny. But I found that when you repot, obviously those trichomes hold on to that soil, and they get quite a grip on there. So I use this makeup brush to lightly brush off the soil that collects. If you don't have a fluffy brush, you can also use a paper towel, and you're just going to fold it up to where all the corners are pointing, and you'll just use that. I also use this water in a spray bottle, and I just wet around the roots. It just gives them some moisture to get started because the wick may need more time. And then, so I brush, I mist, I wipe off the outside of the pots with these disinfecting wipes. And, I just basically clean them up because when I pot them, they get kind of a good bit dirty. So this is a really nice way. And then if you have additional soil or debris or dust on your leaves, you are going to turn the pot like I have it now, and you're going to spray the leaves, and you're going to want the water to roll away from the crown or the center of the plant. Because like I was stating earlier, once you get water in the crown, you have a very high risk of rot from the center. And you just really don't want to have to deal with that because it's easier to prevent it than to react after the fact. So the debris and the soil being on the leaves, honestly, is a small thing. It's not going to harm the plant, but I just think it would look so much neater. So that's why I dust it off. This plant is growing leaves in almost like a hurricane fern. It almost looks like it's twisted, and I do not know why it's doing that. I also changed my fertilizer and mineral regime, vitamin and minerals. So I started using Super Thrive in addition to my fertilizer. And I also learned that the reason my plants bloom all the time, in addition to the lights and the temperature and all the other things being right, is that I've been using a blooming fertilizer. So that Schultz plus African Violet fertilizer is like comes in the droppers. There's some blooms on Louisiana Lullaby. But anyways, I changed to a foliage based or something to encourage foliage. So I'm hoping I don't get any blooms. And every third stalk that pops up, I break it off. So they can I just really want them to focus on blooming at a later time and focus on getting some leaves. So that's what I'm doing now because you can trick them into blooming. Well, thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.